Is it okay? Okay. This project is supported, and I always go over because I get caught up in the map, so I'm going to read most of it. My apologies. This project is supported by a SSHRC research grant, and the PI is Gordon Dare, who's a sociologist from York University. Haiti Wong is a former student and RA of mine at USP, and she signed on to help us with the data and GIS and analysis aspects of the project. I wanted to acknowledge and recognize that what I'm talking about in my presentation today is really history of a colonizing population, and that this doesn't and shouldn't be taken to ignore or diminish the pre-existing First Nations populations, their histories, and traditional rights. And I wish I could have found a better map, but that's just sort of a lesson to all of us about the need for better mapping of indigenous traditional territories. So Dara's research, work on this research goes back to 1979, but a working paper from 2014 outlines its essence. He sampled household records from the 1861 and 71 censuses, recording all the individual information. Then he attempted to link individuals from the earlier and later censuses based on name, age, family context, etc. He divided the people who he was able to link between 1861 and 1871 records into stayers and movers. Stayers who didn't move between the two periods, and movers who changed location. From this detailed sample of migrants, we're analyzing how mobile the population was based on the newer paradigm of transiency being a central aspect of life in 19th century North America. Previous case studies show a lot of people moved, both close by and far across the region of southern Ontario in and around this time period. The study area for this research is the west central region of southern Ontario. In many ways, this is not ideal. The whole province of Canada West, as it was known in 1861, would have been much better, but methodological issues and other reasons for this decision and information about the sampling of the data, etc., and how the linkages were done, they're all available online. You probably can't read that, but I'll put this up on the website, or you can email me for the link. So this is a summary table of the sample and linkages that were made of the almost 36,000 individuals comprising the sample in the 1861 census. Almost 14,000 of them were found again in 1871. There are many reasons why a person would have disappeared from the records. So we're just looking at those people who we could find who stayed within the study area, first of all, and who we could be reasonably sure was the same person. So this map shows the sample population, all of the 14,000 people, as green proportional circles, and the stayers and movers in the smaller pie graphs, stayers in red and movers in blue, within the larger sample. You can see that the proportion we were able to link was relatively consistent, but there was a lot of variation in the numbers of those who stayed in the same subdivision and those who moved away. So the sizes of the wedges in the pies were significantly different in different places. Some populations were a lot more stable and some a lot more mobile. And of course, there may be many different reasons why an individual would move. For economic opportunity, or for cultural familiarity, as part of a family, or striking out alone, across the province to find new frontiers, or to the nearest local city or town to find wage labor. What we do know is that there was a lot of migration. We hypothesize that much of this is movement of families, bringing along children with parents, and that there was a mixture of a lot of local and a lot of cross-regional movement. Our strategy in this part of the research is really still primarily data exploration. So all these maps are experiments that we're using to try and visualize what the actual situation was. We're using these tools, GIS tools, to map and describe the geographic patterns of movement and relate them to the underlying demographic or environmental configurations. So that's the first flow map, origin destination map, that we created of all of the migrants in the sample. And it's cartographically massaged, it's color-coded, and the lines are different widths to relative size. And yet, so there's a lot of movement that we were able to find, and it's all around the study area as expected. But how to make sense of this confusing, overwhelming pattern? And I gave a preliminary talk where last year at COGS, where I went into a lot of different possibilities. So I won't go into a lot of that right now. But I'll just mention, discuss it briefly. There's actually quite a robust literature on the visualization of flow maps, looking at the twin goals of the understanding of overall flows and trends in the patterns while maintaining detailed data on demand. So graphic cluttering is obviously a challenge. There are approaches to dealing with this that emphasize the graphic design aspect and those that emphasize statistical summarization or filtering or combinations of these to deal with it. It should be said that the goal here is not only strategies that work for this one project, but that there are a number of other projects underway to use large-scale data mining and automated matching technologies to link individuals across censuses and other historical records. So the idea is that technologies or approaches that we develop here might be applicable to larger studies in different locations as well. Here are a few of the sort of possible approaches that people have used, combining graphical and statistical manipulation to visualize migration flows. Anita Grazer has championed and developed an edge bundling approach on the top left there to consolidate and simplify major trends in complicated flows. Guo and Zhu on the top right there have written a lot about how to select the primary flows, smooth and combine similar lines, and map them effectively. And Slingsby et al. In the bottom right take a different approach, constructing an origin-destination matrix, kind of a cartogram of small multiple maps, which can then be used to visualize migration statistics across a region. And that's actually the counties in Ireland that they've matricized. So we looked at a few different ways of summarizing our migration flow maps. We looked at aggregating to fewer than the original 206 regions, grouping the census subdivisions that we were using by the numbers of migrants, by the quantity, areas of high or low migration. We also looked at different ways of disaggregating or filtering out migrant groups, subgroups, to see what the picture looked like when split apart into these subgroups. And we looked at different kinds of base maps we might use as a background context to view underneath the migration flows to help try to explain them. So the next few slides just deal with the cartographic experimentation we did in working out our approach. The first is this edge bundling technique, simplified by aggregating the census subdivisions from 206 to 100, but still a very complicated picture. Although you can see the western flow overall trend, the origin of the flows being in yellow and the destinations being in blue. So generally people were moving east to west, but maybe too confusing to be looking at all these moving people together as one monolithic migrant population. So we looked at different types of census data, demographic data from the published census volumes in 1861 and 71 to use as context base maps. This is from 1861 Table 1, breaks down all the census subdivisions by the place of birth of their residents. So in this case, it's mapping the Irish-born proportion of the population. And there were a lot of Irish in this region. And you can see a pattern is certainly outlined using choropleth mapping. Many of these people immigrated during the Great Irish Famine period of 1845 to 1850, or shortly thereafter, so they would be there in our time period. We also looked at different economic environmental variables in the census, such as the percent of land under cultivation in each subdivision. So this certainly provides background context for 1861 in terms of agricultural development. The western townships were still on the agricultural frontier, many with less than 20% of their land being farmed. The relative suitability or quality of land for agriculture was also obviously a determinant. So one factor in the migration picture was how easily available good farmland was available, how much of it there was, how much was for sale, and at what prices. So the approach we decided to use for the present to focus on was to split the migrants into different immigrant communities, so by place of birth, and presume that there's a gravitational attraction between similar social and cultural groups, that is, different place of birth groups, so that migrants from the same place of birth would move into areas that were already settled, heavily settled by their compatriots. So for example, we mapped migrants between 1861 and 71 from families in 1861 which had Irish-born heads of the household, overlaid on a base map showing Irish-born population in 1861, the origin year. So here we have the map separating out the migrant populations. This shows migrants from Irish families in green, superimposed on Scots family migrants in blue. Sort of for the color conventional sort of cliches. We decided to justify it by going by their flags. So we observed that between Scots and Irish, there did appear to be significant differences in the patterns which supported the overall approach. To generalize a lot, the general trend of movement of Scots seemed to be more north to south and diagonally southwest to, or southeast to northwest, while the Irish more east to west. Of course, there's lots of internal variation in these pictures, but the patterns are considerably different. And here's the standard symbolization again that we use, line width and color to emphasize the lower and higher flows of migrants. In terms of mapping the immigrant population, we first tried this standard choropleth mapping. This did highlight patterns in the population density of the different groups. For example, Irish were much more concentrated in the eastern and central study area, and the Scots more in the northern and western areas, and the Scots in blue very sparse in the central area there, southwest of Lake Simcoe, which is that, and the Niagara Peninsula, for example. We also tried mapping the dominant birthplace in each census subdivision, excluding Canadian-born. So again, we see the overall pattern of dominance of the different immigrant groups. The Irish generally more central, the Scots in the west, and the English dominant along the north shore of Lake Ontario, and the fairly isolated, segregated German communities in Waterloo County, which stand up there in the central south. However, the dominance map concealed too much of the internal variation to be useful as a background for migration flows, we decided. This map shows the 1861 proportions of birthplaces as pie graphs, the same colors as before, and Canadian-born and in white. But it shows how close in magnitude different immigrant groups were in many areas. So in many areas there were 20% of Irish and 20% of Scots. And so using a sort of either or dominance map didn't make sense. We needed more local variation and detail than that in our base mapping. Of course, there are other statistics that can be used for mapping relative dominance, and we're experimenting with some of those. Okay, I've got about 10 more, so I'm going to go through pretty quickly. So eventually we decided that proportional circles scaled in a standardized way for all the different immigrant groups was what we would use as the background map, because even though they are a more complex symbolization, they give a better overall impression of distribution. And here are the maps we generated for each of the 4 groups: Irish, Scots, English, and German. And here's the results for the Scots, overlaying the migration flow arrows for Scottish families on top of the proportional circles of Scots population. We can see there's a lot of movement between the fairly large centers of Scots population, and there's also quite a lot of flyover movement, that is, areas where Scots aren't, like in the center there, where all the arrows are basically flying over. However, being a cartographer, I wondered, how could we gild this particular lily? Is there some way of graphically highlighting the areas of concentrated population by grouping or symbolization that would enhance interpretation? So, once again, I explored the spatial statistics toolbox of ArcGIS, which I'm a bit addicted to. After a period of experimentation, we ended up using the grouping analysis, which has now been called spatially constrained multivariate clustering, in order to highlight areas of clustered high or low values by using this grouping algorithm. I won't go into the details, but the documentation is good in ArcGIS in their website if you're interested. To create 20 groups and color highlight them in order to identify where areas were of higher concentration and let the gray area circled in the middle there lower concentration, and try to use this as a background, an enhanced background for the mapping of the migrant populations. So here are the 4 maps that we created, now color-coded according to this grouping analysis. Okay, so we'll just look at these are preliminary data exploration maps, but we'll start with looking at the German groups because it's the simplest example. The German population in what was called Canada West then, German immigration, a lot of it was resettlement of German-born Mennonites from Pennsylvania Dutch country, and it was centered in Waterloo County. It was well established by this time period. There were smaller enclaves in the north, in Grey Bruce to the north, and in Huron to the south, but almost all of the internal migration here was between the established centers of the German-born population. So it's a good kind of example of a segregated population and an argument in favor of the overall approach. The English and Welsh migrants dominated the north shore of Lake Ontario, and those of English ancestry were the largest segment of the population in the study area. The pattern of migration seems diffuse, with significant rural to urban movement, especially to Toronto, as you can see in the insets in the bottom right. Quite a lot of movement among or between neighboring or close by townships. There were significant numbers of long-range movers as well, especially single individuals moving out to the hinterland. A lot of migration occurred of Scots families, and quite a lot of it long-range to or between the concentrated centers in the western part of the study area. Again, rural to urban migration in Toronto and Hamilton, where there were already large numbers of Scots, also appears. And very little movement occurs in those sparsely settled areas in the middle or down in the Niagara Peninsula. The Irish move more than any other group, and there also appears to be more long-range movement among the Irish, almost all trending east to west. Or they were between townships that were already high in Irish, or areas which had a lot of spread out Irish population. There was a lot of urban to rural migration as well as expected. Almost no west-east movement and very little inter-township movement to the areas of already strong concentration in the east. There my bell went off. So just as a last comment, these kinds of internal historical migration patterns and comprehending them in the context of the economic and cultural climate of the time is obviously a question too complex to deal with a few simple maps. But developing statistical and graphic ways of handling these themes using this kind of approach shows promise in moving us forward to understand these kinds of migration movements. Thanks.